Hello, everyone. I'm Nitya, and I'm from Team Belong. The Belong Online Literature Festival, or BOLF, is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face identity-based discrimination. We run programs for inclusive housing, inclusive mental health, inclusive research, as well as a book club and a library for inclusive literature. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of our festival partners, the buyer, our media partner, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access for All, without whom this event would not be possible. Now, on to today's session. The session is on feeling at home in the world, immigrant identity and belonging, with Guruprasad Kaginele, Mitali Perkins, and Jenny Bhatt. The session will be moderated by Debanjan Chakrabarti. Debanjan is director British Council East and Northeast India. He has over 18 years of experience in leading education, development, and cultural collaboration programs in India and internationally for the British Council. In his present role, he leads all of British Council's business and cultural relations work in East and Northeast India, covering 13 Indian states and Bhutan. A triple gold medalist in English literature from Jadavpur University, Kolkata, Debanjan is a Felix Scholar and obtained his PhD in Literature and Media Studies from the University of Reading. He has been a journalist and taught English literature and taught English literature and films at Visva Bharati University in Shanti Niketan and at the University of Reading. Debanjan is a keen sportsman, an avid reader, and a cinephile. He occasionally writes for national and international publications on education, books, sports, and films.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session, Feeling at Home in the World, Immigrant Identity and Belonging. Good evening, afternoon, and morning, depending on where you are in this wide world of ours. It's a great privilege to be chairing this session on behalf of the British Council, which is one of the partners of the Belong Online Literature Festival. British Council, as most of you may know, is the UK's international organization for cultural relations and education. We have been partnering with a number of organizations since the global pandemic unfolded. Online festivals on thoughts and ideas and in literature. It's part of our Festivals Connect work across India and across the world. Yesterday, as part of the Belong Festival, we screened all our British Council, British Film Institute Flair Festival films on LGBTQI. My colleague Jonathan Kennedy, who's Director of Arts for British Council in India, was the convener of a session yesterday on imagining a new world, utopia and dystopias through the lens of writers from India, with a strong feminist and transgender content in those conversations. This particular session aligns with our long-term cultural values about inclusion, but also I think British Council is responding to and tapping into the zeitgeist of our times. We are talking not just about inclusion, but also it's a time for empathy, of compassion and kindness, and giving everyone a voice and finding our own voices. And I think this, in sync with British Council, the Belong Lit Fest is opening up new audiences and access to diversity of authors with equality of access and inclusion of writers whose voices are often too marginalized. This particular topic, feeling at home in the world, immigration, identity and belonging, reminds me of Rabindranath Tagore's great novel, The Home and the World, Ghore Baire in Bengali, translated as Home and the World. It's also very topical in many ways. I think stories of migration and immigration have fascinated us through human history, and more recently, the topic has haunted us. I'm thinking of the journalist Paul Salopek's epic journey tracing the footsteps of humankind's migration out of Africa as part of a National Geographic project. I'm thinking of the shocking image of Aylan Shenu, the 3-year-old Syrian refugee child who drowned in the Mediterranean Sea on the beaches of Turkey while fleeing religious persecution in Syria. And haunting stories and images of migrant laborers trying to reach their homes from Indian cities after the announcement of the sudden lockdown in India in end of March. Especially 16 migrant laborers were run down by a goods train on the 7th of May. And those images of their meager belongings, including dry chapatis, their blood-smeared chappals scattered on the railway tracks, are haunting and topical. So in the long sweep of history, the big question is, who is not a migrant or an immigrant? I'm also thinking in terms of the writing traditions of other languages in India. So Syed Mujtaba Ali in Bangla had written extensively about his experience of living in Afghanistan, in Berlin, and across the Indian subcontinent, the undivided pre-independence Indian subcontinent. I'm thinking of the writings of Rahul Sankritan in Hindi, who wrote extensively about his itinerant ways of life from across the world, primarily Egypt, in erstwhile Soviet Union, all of that. So I'm incredibly excited to be chairing a panel with 3 very, very exciting authors from around the world today. Let me quickly introduce them to you. We have with us today Jenny Bhatt. Jenny is a writer, a literary translator, a literary critic, and a podcast host. She has worked her way around India, England, Germany, Scotland, and various parts of the US. She now lives in a suburb of Dallas in Texas. She's a host of the Desi Books podcast. Her short story collection, Each of Us Killers, will be out on 8th of September this year with 7.13 books. Her fiction has been nominated for Pushcart Prizes and the 2017 Best American Short Stories. She was a finalist for the 2017 Best of the Net anthology. She tweets from @Jenny Bhatt. The second author we have with us is Mitali Perkins. Mitali Bose Perkins has written many books for young readers, including Between Us and Abuela, Forward Me Back to You, You Bring the Distant Near, and Rickshaw Girl, which has been adapted into a film by Sleeper Wave Productions. She was born in Kolkata, also incidentally a city I call home, and immigrated with her parents to California, where she currently lives and writes. Her books have won many awards: the America's Award for Children's and Young Adult Literature, SLJ, and the Kirkus Best Young Adults Book of the Year. She tweets from @Mitali Perkins. The third author we have today is Guruprasad Kaginele. He is a medical doctor by profession, lives with his family in Rochester, Minnesota, where he works at the Olmsted Medical Center. Kaginele has been a prominent voice in contemporary Kannada literature. He has published 3 short story collections, 3 novels, and 2 essay collections. He has also been the primary editor for 2 books published by the US-based group Kannada Sahitya Ranga. Some of his short stories have been translated into Telugu, Konkani, Malayalam, and English. His recent novel, Hijab, published in 2017, was adjudged the best novel of the year 2018 by Sahitya Sabha. So, Guruprasad tweets from @GKaginele1, and he's also on Instagram. I suppose I'll kick off this conversation with an initial question to all 3 of my panelists. Do you see yourself as an immigrant writer or as a writer who writes about the immigrant experience? Starting off with Jenny, if I may come to you first, Jenny.
Thank you, Debanjan. And thank you to Team Belong for having all of us on this very interesting and relevant topic. So to answer your question, Debanjan, I see myself as an immigrant writer who does not only write about immigrant experiences. So the reason is, obviously, I am an immigrant. That is very much a part of my identity. But I think we get boxed into, certain topics with some of these labels. And I understand it is a function of the publishing industry and how they market. And so, we have this whole category or genre, if you like, called immigrant literature. But I would like to think that my writing and my translation work and my criticism work isn't just focused on the immigrant experience. That said, of course, we can't escape from bringing our personal experiences to our reading. And so when I look at, in particular, when I look at South Asian literature or Desi literature, I'm certainly looking at it not just from a certain kind of a school of literary theory, but I'm also looking at it very much from a post-colonial lens, because that is part of my heritage as somebody who was born and brought up in India for the first 19 years of my life.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I'll come back to you on that point in a bit. If I may come to you, Guru, for addressing this core question.
Yeah, I am a bit unique in this aspect because I write in Kannada. I've been in United States for last 25 years, but I chose to write in Kannada. But I do write about my immigrant experience. And I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is when do we cease to be an immigrant? We came to America as immigrants, and when does this immigration end? Is it like, because once we get the American passport, we become Americans? Do we call ourselves Americans? Are our kids who have grown up here, are they like Americans? And what is an American identity? I'll just give you a small example. It's like a little story. I work in the emergency room and I see patients from different cultural background, and we have physicians from different background. And it happened so that a few months ago, a 21-year-old Caucasian checked in with abdominal pain, and he was greeted in the front door by a Sudanese greeter. She was the HUC, health unit coordinator, and he was checked in to the room and was taken care of by a Korean nurse. And me being an Indian emergency room physician, diagnosed him having appendicitis, and we wanted him to be operated upon. And when I told him that you need to get surgery done, and then the business office, who goes and collects this information, and he happened to be a Somali kid, and the surgeon was from Tanzania. So we are like all from all over, and all of us are, by legally, we are all Americans. And this kid wanted an American surgeon to operate on him. So we were kind of a little bit like amused and at the same time confused from his question. And exactly, what do you mean you want like American doctor? All of us are Americans. No, I'm just talking about, in this kid's mind, I can call 21-year-old kid because my daughter is 24. In this kid's mind, American is like,
White.
Defined by the skin, skin color more than anything. And the funny part is some of these 21-year-old, the Somali the office person who was registering, he was born in United States. So he was confused as to what his identity was. I think this is like a question that we always have to ask ourselves. The funny thing is, when this kid decided to check himself out against medical advice to see an American doctor in a different hospital, he decided to walk out with his IV in, and we need to chase him to bring him back to the hospital to pull the IV out. And the security guard happened to be another Somali. So he said, this kid says, you know, even when you kick me out of the hospital, can't you find like an American security guard? And I think this is something that we, you know, this whole theory of melting pot versus Shashi Tharoor's Thali, we kind of, I think this pot itself is changing. What we feel right now is what we used to melt in the pot, but we have become a part of this melting pot itself. You know, these quote unquote immigrants who come from different areas. So when I write about these experiences, do I call this as human experience? I'm a human being experiencing other human beings' feelings, or do I call this as an immigrant experience is always a question. So I think it all depends on when you define yourself as an immigrant and when this immigration process ceases.
Right. I'll come back to that question, Guru, on how that impacts your writing. Over to Mitali. Do you see yourself as an immigrant writer, or a writer who simply happens to write about that experience?
Well, it's interesting. I'm right in the middle of that story, Guru. I want to know what happened to that kid, and you told that story. So
Exactly. Yeah.
Just it's funny and it's sad at the same time, and it really does highlight one of the issues I face, which is that people, as Jenny said, try to box you in with one of your identities. One of them for me is an immigrant, and I'm happy to stay there. But I also, I'm a mother. And so part of me responding to that story is from a mother heart. I'm thinking, oh, you dumb kid, go get your appendix out. What is wrong with you? So I have many identities and they intersect around every story. So I would probably say the latter, that one of the things I write about is the immigrant experience. And yet I deeply cherish the immigrant identity as well. I feel it's a privileged identity because it gives you the capacity to see, and also to feel compassion, I think, on both sides of the story. You know, when Guru was telling that story, you can connect to each character because you have this ability to cross borders. I came as a child, and so I learned how to do that code switching dance between cultures. And so I can enter into almost anyone's story because of that. So I cling very fiercely to my identity as an immigrant because it gives me that capacity to cross borders.
It's fascinating to hear that the way you say that you know, being an immigrant is as a badge of honor, as it were. If I can continue with you, Mitali, before going back to the others, you were born in Calcutta and then moved to the US at a young age with your parents. So what does the idea, the word home mean to you, and how do you relate to that to the idea of the world in your writing?
Right. It's funny because you were talking about Jadavpur University, and my mom went there, and there's so many connections to Kolkata. It still feels like home when I go there because it's my mother tongue. And so language becomes a big part of that. But my husband says that because of this code switching capacity that I developed, when you come as a child, you have to survive in both worlds. I was in a majority white suburban middle school, and I had to learn how to, curl my hair the right way. And yet at home, my parents grew up in the villages of East Bengal. So it wasn't sophisticated Bengali urban life. It was village Bengal at home. So I did that dance every day, California suburb, Bengali village. Because of that, my husband says that I've learned at this stage of my life, now that I'm older, I can make myself at home anywhere. He says I go into an elevator, a lift, and I can make myself at home there and sort of create little bonds between people because I did that as a child. But at the same time, I don't feel at home anywhere. I feel at home nowhere. Nowhere really feels like when I go to Kolkata. I'm a large Bengali woman, and most Bengali women are really small. So they have the ladies section there of the buses. So I hold on to the bar, and all the little Bengali ladies hold on to my arm because I have that health and strength. I think that came from, I don't know where that came from. I'm sort of an aberration. So I think that just that identity of making myself at home everywhere, it's very easy to me. And I think that's when I think of the world, I think of the world as my place of service, a place where I can try to make others feel at home in my company and in my stories, especially children who often are trying to find where home is. So I think the world is the place of service, and home is wherever I am and nowhere in the world.
That's absolutely fascinating. Hold on to that thought, and we'll expand on that in a bit. Jenny, if I may come to you. In our conversations in the run-up to this panel discussion, you observed that, and I quote you, "I've always agreed with what Jhumpa Lahiri points out in a 2013 New York Times interview. I don't know what to make of the term immigrant fiction." So my question to you is, what do you make of the term immigrant fiction?
Thanks, Debanjan. Yeah, I mean, I think what I said was I do agree with Jhumpa Lahiri's point, which is that if you think about it, all American fiction is immigrant fiction, because we've all come from somewhere in the US. And, you know, if it wasn't the writer themselves, it was their parents or their parents' parents. And so, you know, in that sense, we're all migrants. We're also migrants in terms of when we're writing fiction, we're living in other worlds, we are living in other lives. And I feel that that is also a kind of transplantation or migration that happens, even though it is not a physical one. So, you know, again, as I said, I do understand that publishers and you know, marketing people and booksellers need to have a category called immigrant fiction or immigrant literature so they can direct people to that. And I do think, I mean, I went through a phase of my life where before I was able to skillfully code switch, you know, like Mitali said, I was drawn more to writing by Indian writers who were also immigrants, because I felt that they spoke my language, they spoke about my challenges and my thoughts and my difficulties. So I can understand why there is a need for something called immigrant fiction. But I think it's the way that it is then marketed and perceived, that it's as if that is the overall thing that you find in that work. You're not, there are other stories, there are other aspects of human life, as Guruprasad was saying. So again, you know, I'm still very fluid on that term, but I find that all fiction is immigrant fiction. That I agree with Jhumpa Lahiri on that.
Right, right. Thanks. And we will come back to you on that with reference to your work. So let me come to Guru. Well, first, let's hear the ending of that fantastic story. What happened to that young boy?
Well, I told you that, like, I think this kid did get signed against medical advice. He checked into another hospital. We don't know about what happened to the kid. I hope somebody, he found the right doctor, whoever he thinks as American is, to operate on him. You know, that's we can only do so much. You know.
Exactly, which is a nice segue to the question I had for you next, which is about your recent novel Job, which has been translated to great critical acclaim by Simon and Schuster into English in 2018. The novel takes a very sharp look at the overlapping identities that we were speaking about, of race, of faith, and countries of origin among various immigrants through the lenses of three Kannadiga doctors in a small town in Minnesota. Has that novel changed somewhat in the process of translation? And does translation itself represent a migration of sorts?
Can you repeat the second part of the question? I had a hard time hearing.
The second part of the question, you can come back to it a little later. Does the act of translation from Kannada to English, is that a migration of sorts?
Yeah, well,
kind of literary migration, if you like.
That's a very interesting question, because the process of translation, when does it start for me, is something, you know, this is the first work that was translated from Kannada to English, first of my works of the 9 books that I have written so far. And I never thought that any of my works would be translated. I'm like a full-time emergency medicine physician, so writing came to me later, 20 years ago. So when I write about everything that, by definition of immigrant fiction, whatever the definition of immigrant fiction belongs, I mostly write immigrant fiction, if there is a genre called like that. And then when I write about immigrant fiction, I am writing about America in Kannada to Kannada readers. So every character of mine in the novels, none of them speak Kannada, but I'll bring them back to this world of Kannada where my reader can resonate his thoughts or their thoughts too. He can identify with everything that's happening to them. So I have already begun the process of translation when I'm writing in Kannada. So it's kind of everything that is happening in an English-speaking country. I'm telling that story to Kannada readers. So I need to make sure that everybody is on the same page. Language is just a medium for me to communicate my thoughts, and whichever language that I can communicate my thoughts to my readers, which I'm comfortable in Kannada, so I do that. So that is one process of the translation. The second process was when this book in Kannada, I was very surprised that, this is happening in some Midwest, in a small town in Midwestern America, and Kannada readers were really enthralled by reading this, and there was potential for translation. So when this process happened from Kannada to English, it is bringing back the story back to Minnesota, to English. And who were the intended audience, who were the intended readers at that time? It was kind of the translation. I should make a mention of my great translator, Pawan Rao, with whom I worked with. He made this translation process so fluid. We sat day in and day out, working with each other on each draft. So have I gained or have we changed? I think we always feel that things get lost in translation, but I feel that this novel has gained quite a bit in translation, because even though it was, I was the author, so we kind of were at liberty to make whatever changes that we thought was appropriate when we brought it back to English. And one of the changes was we refer to a specific country when I was writing the Kannada novel, and we made it as a fictional country when we brought back to English. I think if you read the novel, you probably will know exactly why the change was made. I think Debanjan did allude to this in the email conversation. I said I will expand on it when I'm talking about it. I think the reason is when in Kannada, when you're writing in Kannada, it gives you that distance, thinking that you are unconsciously, this process is working in your mind, that I'm writing to someone else. I'm writing to Kannada readers who may or may not get it. It's not like deliberate, but it unconsciously works in your mind that your readers are different. And when you're writing in English, all of a sudden it puts you in a different box where you all of a sudden start thinking about, am I appropriating the culture? Do I know about this culture? Because that like this will be read by wider audience, and I need to be, I need to address all the concerns before
Right.
I write that. So those kind of changes did happen. I think it happened for good. That's what I think. Yeah.
Mm. Thanks, Guru. If I can come to you, Mitali, on again related to what Guru was saying and about his novel, which is founded on his lived experience. Mitali, you yourself write about a range of subjects, and most of your work is aimed at young adults, and you choose subjects that range from immigration to poverty to human trafficking, microcredits, and these are shaped by your own experience as well as your academic grounding in political science and public policy. So are these subjects a conscious choice that are founded on your lived and academic experience, and are they always autobiographical in nature?
You know that finishing a novel from start to finish is the most torturous work you'll ever do. So it has to be an idea that grips you. And for me, these issues of justice have always been a passion of mine. When I studied in college, my goal, when you're young, you have these high, lofty ideals. And I thought, by the end of my life, there'll be no child hungry on the earth, and child hunger will be eradicated, and it'll be due to me, of course, So I had that lofty ideal, that then you come crashing down when you hit reality. And I realized how powerful stories are, I think, around the time that I became a mother. And I had always read growing up, and I had seen the power of a story, especially as I talked about the fluency of a child across borders. That shuts down as you get older into your teen years. But a child is able to cross borders and imagine other lives much better than an adult. And I knew that my heart had been shaped by the books I'd read, especially when it came to justice. So, going back to my birth in Kolkata, Debanjan, it was my celebrity moment when I was born, because I was born in Sheba General Hospital. And at the time when I emerged from my poor mother, I was almost 11 pounds heavy. And so I shattered the records of Sheba General Hospital, and I made the headlines in Kolkata that said, fattest baby ever born in Sheba General Hospital. So that was my celebrity moment. And I think, my father was a port engineer, so we lived in Cameroon and Ghana, Mexico, and I saw quite a lot of poverty growing up. And I think that privilege that I had coming into this wonderful, healthy, educated family that gave me so much, and then the books I read as a child developed in me this desire to explore justice, and for people with less privilege than I had. So I often explore those topics. I think, again, going back to the fact that when I'm in the middle of a novel, if I don't care about it deeply, I'm just going to toss it. So I have to care about it very deeply.
Right.
So those are the issues I care about.
Thanks, Mitali. Which also brings me to Jenny now. And again, it's a related question on living a very itinerant life. Jenny, you have lived a very itinerant life in India, England, and Scotland. And I like the distinction that you make between England and Scotland. They are really very different kind of cultures and two evolved nations. And Germany. So I was just wondering that how have you channelized living those lives in separate countries, maybe separate lives in separate countries in various cultures, and channelize them into your writing?
Yes, thank you, Debanjan. So I never had a plan to go to all these places. Most of my time in these places was driven because of my work. I worked in the corporate sector before I turned to writing full time. And so I went where the job took me. And maybe there's something as to me volunteering for some of those projects and opportunities as well. But, I did end up going to these places for work. So, I moved to the US, I think it was 98. And then in the US as well, I worked my way around Michigan, Ohio, California, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and then now Texas. And so I think part of this is even in India, actually. So I grew up in Dhanbad on the eastern side, and then I was in Bombay, and then I was in Maharashtra, northern Maharashtra. So I think what happens is that if you've had a life of moving around quite a bit, like Mitali was saying, you're not, home is everywhere. Home isn't any one place. And as a writer, I think that's really cool in a way, because it works to your advantage, because whenever you go to some place, you're going to be looking at it from the eyes of an outsider. you're going to be exploring it and looking at it with maybe a fresh set of eyes. And that's definitely been the case for me. So with my writing, I'm definitely, still trying to explore and understand. I usually, my writing is driven by questions. And so I'm always, if I'm writing about something, it's because I don't understand it. I have to write about it to figure it out in my head. And so that's my primary driver. And so whatever I'm writing, whichever place I'm writing about, whichever culture I'm writing about, it's because I'm trying to understand it. I'm trying to make some sense of it, trying to connect some of the dots. So with my upcoming short story collection, for example, there are stories that are set in the UK, there are stories set in the US, there are stories that are set in Mumbai, Gujarat, so they're, like me, the stories are from all over, although there's a uniting theme in that, which is, it's the intersection of labor and our emotional lives. And so I think, to your question, is the itinerant life has certainly reflected in my writing. It certainly helps me approach a place with the eyes of somebody who's more of an explorer. I'm not looking, when I explore in my work, I'm not looking to fully describe a place as authentically as I can. I'm looking, as you've said before, I'm looking to share my perspective. This is how I, as an outsider, see what's going on. And I think there's some merit to having that perspective, at least for me as a writer. So yeah, that's how I approach, that's how my life and my writing. Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating, because apart from the Kolkata connection, I was born and raised in Bihar, not too far from Dhanbad, so in a copper mine town called Khatchila, which is its own literary greatness through the writings of Bibhushan Bandyopadhyay, the author on whose film Pather Panchali, The Song of the Road, Ray's famous film, is based. We have some brilliant questions coming in from our audience this evening here. I'll start with one from Rana, and I'll quickly summarize this question as I go along. This is for all three of you. Please feel free to volunteer. So what does religion play a major, is it a huge factor in the identity of immigrants abroad, and is that related to the kind of jingoistic patriotism, Rana says, towards the country of origin? Jenny, why don't you, would you like to take that question, and as we move to Guru and then Dali on that question of religious identity and immigration?
Well, see, for me, I was born in a Hindu family, but my religious identity has never really been an important driver, whenever I've, wherever I've lived, because what I've done, and I don't know if everyone does this, but I go along with the local culture. And so when I was in the UK, Christmas Eve, I went to church with my friends. New Year's Day, I would go for the morning service. Here in the US, my husband is Punjabi, and so we go to the Gurdwara, the local Gurdwara. So for me, I find just assimilating in that sense, because I'm very curious about those religions. To me, a religion is really a way of life, right? There are traditions, there are rituals, there are aspects to that culture. And so it's not so much about, and I'm also curious about different belief systems. So for me, I have not found that to be an issue. Now, I agree, religion is a big part of immigrant identity. And we've seen in the US some very dangerous effects of that, where we've had, very recently, that there have been attacks on minority religious places of worship. And so I understand that, and I understand the seriousness of how important religion is a part of immigrant identity. I just don't have the best answer for myself personally. To me, I just assimilate in whichever culture I'm in. I try to understand and get to know the religion of that place.
Right. Can I quickly come to Guru for a short, quick answer to that question about the role of religion in your writing? Is that important?
Sure. Yeah, I think it does play a huge role. Again, I'll tell a quick story which conveys my point. Again, my writing is a product of my work. And I can tell that like if I was not a physician, especially emergency physician, I wouldn't have been a writer probably. I was working in an ER one shift, and some guy came in after like 6 to 8 hours after dislocating his shoulder. He fell and dislocated his shoulder. He did come in. Basically, he was a veteran. You know, he had worked in he had gone to Afghanistan for war, and he had lost one of his legs, and because of that, he had become like a drug addict. You know, like a narcotic abuse because of multiple medication that he had taken in. And he came in, he asked me, can you put the shoulder back without giving me any narcotic pain medications, without putting me to sleep? I said, like, I don't think it's possible because you've done this quite a bit. This shoulder is out for like a long time, and I have to sedate you before that. His worry is, it's like alcoholics, right? Like when they sip a drop of alcohol, they fall off the wagon. So he's like thinking that if you put me to sleep by giving me narcotics, I'll probably become like, start abusing narcotics again. So please don't do this. And we tried and tried, nothing happened. So I had to sedate him. Before he was going to sleep, he looked at me and told, "Doctor, are you an Arab?" He asked me, "Are you an Arab?" And that didn't really, "Are you a Muslim? Are you an Arab?" And that didn't really, I mean, he fell asleep and he woke up. And then once the shoulder is back, and when they come out, he was, he was swearing. He was swearing profusely, with the anti-Muslim rhetoric, and I didn't really get exactly what was saying. Then he apologized, for no fault of his. He just by being in the war, going to a different country and thinking that I was an Arab, it's like a PTSD for him. So these kind of things do happen, and the novel Hijab is based on this religion, culture, and how it affects our identity as an American, because all of us come to this country to be an American, or to be a part of this American dream. And exactly what this American dream is, what do we identify as, whom do we identify as American, is something that we need to ask ourselves. And religion, which religion you are coming from, especially in post 9/11 period, this becomes like a huge factor. That's what I think.
Yeah. Over to you, Mitali, to address the question of religion or faith in your writings.
I'll just touch on it quickly. I think the distinction that Jenny made between the cultural artifacts of a religion and the belief is very important to me, because so I think both of the cultural part of it is, the traditions, the holidays, those things, when I had my first Christmas here in America and I didn't know anything about Christmas, I just thought some fat guy came and gave presents to everyone else except me. And then that's how I viewed Christmas, as it was very much as an outsider. So, but then there's that true meaning of Christmas, which I didn't hear until much later. So I think the belief and the culture are very different. Her second question, Rana, I'm not sure if it's their second question, is the jingoistic patriotism toward the country of origin. Does that come with it? I would say the opposite, that when you cross a border, as I said, it keeps you really close to both cultures. You're able to see both the good and the bad in both cultures. And so I think I've lost any ability to be patriotic jingoistically, whether it be in India, they just renamed, I know you guys know, the Fair and Lovely skin cream to Glow and Lovely skin cream. But growing up, those skin creams were always thrust at me and to use, and I hated it, I resisted it. But here, of course, you can see the way that elders are treated so horribly here in America. And I think I watched my parents honor their parents, and I'm trying to do the same with my parents as they age. So that comes right out of my Bengali village heart. So I would say that I'm able to see good in both systems, and also some of the things that need to be corrected in both. So there's no patriotism that's jingoistic. Sadly, I've lost the ability to really say, yeah, I'm an American. Oh, I love India. It's perfect in every way. It's gone forever for me.
if I can just add one little sentence, when
Yes,
you
please.
talked about jingoistic patriotism, I know probably Mitali and Jenny, your experience is a bit different than mine. I think the very typical example that you see nowadays is like a middle class corporate sector working like a Hindu, mostly Hindu Americans, meaning like Hindu Indians who have the job and they're raising their family in America. They start complaining about mushrooming of all these madrasas and mosques in the streets of India, in Bangalore, whereas they don't complain about mushrooming of temples in America. It's like we want whichever serves to our purpose. We are like one of those guys which, if it serves to have an anti-Trump rhetoric here, we would do that because it serves to our purpose. Whereas if you go back to India, it'll be completely opposite. So I don't know if you call this as religion or like jingoism, whatever you see that quite a bit. I think we need to look and touch on that because that is like a real issue. We kind of change our identity based on where we are, just based on whether it serves our purpose or not.
That's
I
a
think
political identity, right?
Yeah. It is almost an opportunistic exceptionalism is how I'll call it.
Yeah.
Jenny, would you like to take that question from Vijay Lakshmi, which is a really very interesting question about whether Western publishers' view of Indian writing, whether it's too Indian or not Indian enough. I think if you would like to take that.
That is a question that I think I could probably eventually write an essay about, because I've had experiences with publishing in India where, even though I grew up in India and I go back and forth, I spent the last 6 years actually living in India, but I've had experiences where they felt sometimes that my writing wasn't Indian enough because I've been out of India. And then when you come here and I'm writing about India, then it's like, oh, well, it's too Indian, and we've already got an Indian author this year, so I don't know that we want to take you on necessarily. And so I've had kind of experiences on both sides, and with my translation work as well. I think the Bernardine Evaristo was quoted in that one article, and there's this huge diversity in publishing study that was done in the UK, which I read, all 44 pages of, and I tweeted the whole thing because it was so important. I believe that things are getting better in terms of publishers being more aware that there is more than one Indian story, and that there are different experiences and different South Asian narratives. It's not just all about slums and terrorism and immigration and arranged marriages, that there are many other kinds of stories. So I do believe that's opening up a little bit, but I think we have a long way to go. Just recently, this year in particular, there have been two, what the US and the UK presses have called runaway bestsellers from Indian origin authors. And nothing to take away from those authors, who I will not name, but nothing to take away from those authors, but they have definitely picked up on those time-worn tropes of slum life and terrorism. And so what happens is, that's what Western publishers and Western readers get, right? They get those time-worn tropes and they're used to those. And so they're not wanting to look at other human stories. And in India or South Asia, we're not just about those things. We're about so many things. So I do believe that there's a lot more work that needs to be done as far as the publishing industry opening up to different narratives and opening up to different tropes and stories. But it is better than when I started querying my book in 2017. It's definitely moving in the right direction.
So yeah, I think that's a great prompt for me to come to Mitali to respond to Kirsten's question, which is on if all literature is immigrant literature, doesn't this disregard or even erase indigenous literatures? Would you like to respond to that question, Mitali? And then I'll come back to the panelists for your final summary.
Yes, that becomes a question that is really looking at the question of appropriation and power. I think I answered it in the chat a little bit about the fact that most indigenous cultures now can't remain untouched as storytellers by the majority culture. They have to cross borders as well. But it becomes a question of power, and storytelling is a very powerful media. Who tells the story about whom? Who solves the problem? Who saves the day? Those are all big questions. And we're wrestling with that as a writing community. Who has the right to tell a story? So I think for the indigenous peoples who are traditionally oppressed and marginalized, even to the point of genocide, their voices have been silenced for so long that history matters. The history of a storyteller matters. I wrote Rickshaw Girl. I'm from a Hindu family, and it's about a Muslim Bangladeshi rickshaw puller's daughter. And so when I wrote it in the States, people said, oh, she's tapping into her indigenous culture, Bengali culture. And if you know anything about the history of Hindu Bengalis and Muslim Bengalis, you know that my ancestors oppressed Muslims. You know that I come from that, in East Bengal, we were the landowners. So it's just as much of a power border crossing for me as it would be for a white writer to write about an indigenous person here in the States. So it becomes a question of power and appropriation. And I think as writers, we have to think very, very carefully about what border crossings are we making in telling the story. And if there's somebody else who is closer, whose ancestry, I think history and ancestry does matter. We'd like to think it doesn't, but it does. Which types of people my ancestors killed matters. And so I have to ask these questions, and I try to, I don't think that means that we can't cross any border. I think it means that we have to do it very humbly. And there's a time period now for indigenous peoples where they haven't been able to tell their own stories. So I would say now's the time to back off, shut up, and just let other voices come up that are more closer to the culture.
I think that's a very powerful word you used, approaching this very humbly. And I'm reminded of the wonderful African proverb which says that if the lions wrote the stories of the hunts, the ending would have been different. So I think thank you for those wonderful perspectives. I think we're running out of time. I would come back to all of you wonderful authors for this great evening with one final question, which I just formulated even as we were speaking, which is, could you tell us about one object at home which inspires your writing? Because this is also about belonging and objects. So reflect on one object at home that inspires your writing. Who will take this first? Mitali, you already have got something. Wonderful. What's that? Tell us about it.
That is my daddy. I have the picture there. He was a wonderful storyteller. I adored him. I was a complete daddy's girl. And he was so proud of me. And that's me with my little chubby cheeks in there, same chubby cheeks I have today. Come from my daddy. My storyteller's heart comes from my dad. I miss him every minute. And so I put that there to remind me that, my love for stories came from my dad.
Right. Just a quick sort of apologies from my side. I was under the impression this goes on till 9, but it goes on till 9:30, which is great because we have so much to talk about. But let me persist with that line of question. So over to Guru. Tell us about one object that inspires your writing, and then we will carry on this wonderful chat that we are having, and Adda as we call it in Bengali.
One object, I'm a little confused. One object at home, you said?
Yeah, at home, or an object that is intrinsic to you, that inspires your writing. But you can't talk about the stethoscope. So
no, yeah, right.
We will not.
See, that's the problem, right? So I think the storytelling in me was probably there for a long time. I used to narrate stories, but I never thought that I was going to be a writer. I think listening to great stories from my parents and reading books. Mostly, I never read like, English literature for a long time, till I didn't read. I never read that for a long time till I was like my teenager in medical school. And I think, mostly my reading and writing or listening to stories probably was the object that inspired me. Again, I had to come back to my professional life because that's where I get most of my stories from, but I'm not going to touch on that at this point because I've talked many things about it.
Debanjan,
If I may come to Denny, one object.
Yeah, so like
you as an
Mitali,
author?
I have my mom, and she was, it's right there on my desk. So she was a big storyteller and a big reader. She loved Gujarati literature. Of course, with 5 children, she was a full-time housewife and mom, and was not able to do what she wanted to do, which is read and write and translate. And so the short story collection that I've got coming out this year happens to be happens to have a story that she used to tell us a lot, a folk tale, a Gujarati folk tale, that I've written about and included a mother figure telling that story, and also Dhumketu, the Gujarati short story pioneer. He was one of her favorite writers, and my first literary translation is a collection of short stories of Dhumketu, which will be out at the end of this year in India with HarperCollins. So she's certainly inspired both of my first books, and I've written about her elsewhere, and she passed away in 2014, but she's still with me every single day.
It's interesting.
Thank you so much. That's
when you code switch as a child, one of the things that you learn how to do is read faces very well. And so even looking at her picture there, Jenny, I could see the sense of humor in her face just from that picture.
Yes. Oh, yes, very much so. Yeah. And her father was an accountant in Africa, and he was also a translator, and so kind of passed down the generations.
Right. So a very layered history of travel and migration in your family. Yes. I wonder if one of you would like to take this very interesting question from Niharika Balian. She asks, do you think that after crossing borders, and I think border crossing is a very important trope in our discussion today, the diaspora, and again, a very interesting term there, the diaspora, especially upper class Hindus, take along with them the ideas of casteism, and in the process of retaining their identity, they end up reinforcing this even more. Jenny, would you like to begin by responding it? And then Mitali and Guru, I'll come to you in that order.
Yeah, I do believe, yes, that there is a lot of casteism in the South Asian diaspora. I'll give you a very quick example. I worked in Silicon Valley for 7 years, and I worked in the tech sector. And believe it or not, but there was casteism among Indian folks, even in Silicon Valley, where we had, folks from the Dalit community, and then you had folks from upper caste Hindu community. And I remember having arguments with my client team about topics related to this, where I felt that somebody was being excluded when they shouldn't have been from certain things, or somebody wasn't getting the credit. And so I definitely think it does happen in the diaspora. And yes, maybe part of it is that it's a way of clinging to an identity for some folks. I don't know how we get rid of it, because it's still there. And, even right now, there's been so much talk about with Black Lives Matter, and you'll hear so much talk about how the South Asian community also has anti-Blackness. There are people who are against, and so there is that as well. So it goes beyond casteism. It takes.
And I think we have the wonderful film Mississippi Masala, which alludes, which tackles it head on.
It does, right? So it exists. It very much. I think the question is a valid question. It very much exists. I see it in WhatsApp forwards from well-meaning elderly South Asian folks. In the forward messages that they send, you still see that happening even today. So it exists, and I don't know. I think each generation we get a little better, and so hopefully it will continue to improve.
Right. If I may come to you, Mitali, on the question of casteism crossing borders with us as we travel.
It's interesting because if let's say a majority white writer was writing about casteism in India, that it matters who's telling the story, I think, because there tends to be, among the farther you are away from a culture, you tend to either become more reverential, like people will say, oh, Indian culture, oh, yoga, and oh, chicken tikka masala, and oh, I love it so much. And that's their connection there. And, you know, then they'll ask me, Guru, they'll say, oh, my doctor is Indian. Do you know him? You know, like, so all these connections they're trying to make, right? But they're so distant from the culture that they tend to be very reverential because they're well-meaning. I see that as that sort of well-meaning approach. The closer we are, though, we see some of the issues like shadism, casteism, the role of women and gender in the villages. Those things are things that I lived. I was a third daughter when I was born, and everybody wept when I was born. The whole family cried, including my mother. So she grew up in the village, as I said. She thought it was her fault. She was taught that she had to give her husband a son, and she didn't. It's one of the reasons why she left Kolkata, I think, is just to get away from that shaming of having 3 daughters. And then I remember taking high school biology and learning about the X and the Y chromosome. Guru, you as a doctor will appreciate this, how science helped my mother. I came running home and I said, Mom, I explained the X and the Y. She was so happy. She said, oh, it is your daddy's fault. She was so excited that it wasn't, she released her shame thanks to science. So I think that I lived that. And so when I can write that, when it comes to gender, I did live that. So I think that it does matter how close you are to the culture, because you can explore both the positives and the negatives in a way. And I think that's why the immigrant writer is important. And I know I said I wasn't an immigrant writer, but a writer who's lived that kind of border crossing, who can see both cultures and translate, as Guru said so beautifully, both a very honest look at the culture. And I'm sure there's issues in my own writing, too reverential or too, you know, but I still think I'm a little closer because I lived it.
Right. Thanks. Over to you, Guru. I mean, how does that question affect your writing?
Yeah, I think
does it at all?
It does affect, you know, I think to put it simply, carrying the baggage of upper caste Hinduism, or like, you know, belonging to upper class Hindu, or you being a upper class Hindu and immigrating to America, carries this bias of you're one shade close to whiteness. You're brown, you're in between black and white. And what exactly were you thinking when you thought of moving to America? What was your American dream? And when we try to buy a house, what did our friends tell you? You know, don't go and buy in this neighborhood, there are too many blacks there. And when I came to Detroit to do my residency, when I was walking from my apartment, when I'm walking my apartment to the hospital, I was told, like, you know, watch out for these muggers, and if something happens, just hand them $1. So this bias is like, you know, we carry this bias, and that if you're a Dalit coming to America, you probably will identify with the person. Where exactly do you identify? You know, you probably identify with the black person who has probably gone through the same, leading the same life that you have led. Whereas if you're an upper caste Hindu, you kind of think that, you know, I am above them. And even now, I'll just give an example. I went and, you know, participated in Black Lives Matter movement, and I went for the protest and everything. I was jogging around my neighborhood, and one black guy who was coming with his earphone on, he said, yo, and without knowing, without realizing, I sped up, you know, for like 2 minutes, and for 10 seconds, my pace went, I was pacing. And when I turned around and looked, he happened to be a colleague of mine from 2 years. You know, he was also a doctor, but this bias, intrinsic bias, you know, I couldn't recognize him. And I was like, felt so ashamed when I stopped and talked to him. Yeah, he said, oh, Guru, you are the racist that runs, you're not the racist that kills. This is something that we carry in our mind, and this is because of our probably upbringing, where we carry these biases with us, and this just stays with us. And probably this will get better with the next generation, but we carry these biases with us, and we have to acknowledge that. It's the first thing that we need to do. If we acknowledge, yes, we have these biases, we have to get rid of it, then at least it's the first step towards making me a better person.
I think that's such a powerful and honest admission, Guru. And thank you for sharing this with all of us. And it's not easy to own up to one's own limitations and biases. Mitali mentioned shadism, which is a wonderful term. Trevor Noah makes a lot of fun about this in his own takes on America and South Africa, but also brings Indians into the mix. Very recently, one of my friends and quite a prominent novelist from Kolkata, Sandeep Roy, wrote about this in one of, I think in the Mint Lounge, about exactly that experience that you described, Guru, about when he goes to the US as a student. He experiences this, that he is advised by other Indian students not to rent a house in so-called disreputable parts of town. As a student in the UK, I've seen that been advised on these things. And working for an international organization which is based in the UK, I find we have wonderful equality, diversity, inclusion values, EDI we call them in short. But they are very Anglocentric, for the lack of a better word. I call them Eurocentric parameters that completely is blind to caste issues. So I think it's a challenge in many of the lives we lead, and I say this with great humility. Again, a word that Mitali used earlier, and Jenny also referred to, as someone with an upper caste surname. I do not believe in caste, but with the upper caste surname, I have to deal with this day in, day out, and with great humility and stepping back from positions of discourses of privilege. So it's quite it's difficult, but I think the conversation needs to happen and action needs to happen on that. There are a couple of interesting questions that have come up, and I would like the panel to address them. There's one from Nitya from the Belong team, which talks about what are your takes on the term third culture kids. What identities does this term amplify, and what does it silence? Third culture kids. Any one of you? Guru, you're on the screen. Maybe you'd like to go first, then we can come to Jenny and then Mitali on this question.
So if I understand third culture kids, and if I understand that right, they're like growing up in America, our kids who are growing up in America. Is that right? Yeah.
I think so. I think
okay,
so. Yeah.
Very, very, it's like their identity is also very fluid. I can very clearly say. I was helping with my daughter's college essay. She grew up in Rochester, Minnesota, which is not a big town. Lots of Lutherans around, Lutheran Christians around, and she grew up. And when she asks, even my son is like 15 years old, when you ask them, where are you from? They say, I'm from Rochester. My parents are from India. This is the typical response you get. But when they write the college story, college essay, their Indianness all of a sudden comes into forefront, because they need to identify themselves as someone unique, someone different with some unique upbringing, which is going to like show them that they're different than other people, other kids in college. They have to pick up their application first. What makes them unique is their Indianness, probably. I think that is how they grow up. They always, I think the second generation, they always carry this badge of Indian, Indian kids most of the times. But I think the way that they are different than us is they have no, at least, I can speak for myself, they have no idea of what casteism is. And they have no idea what caste that, they belong. And when you go to India, when they do, when they see all these things with their grandparents, they kind of just are completely lost because they have no idea what caste is. At least, that phase is gone. And they still grow up as a bit confused kids, but I think that next generation probably things are going to be a lot better. I mean, better in the sense what, you need to, in these days, it's very difficult to define what's good and what's bad. What I think was not good with me is going to get better with them. That's how I feel it as. It's all very relative.
I think that's a very powerful observation, Guru, because I'm reminded of Nandan Nilekani's book, Imagining India, where he refers to migration from Indian villages to cities, and he has this great hope that a large-scale migration to Indian cities will, over a period of time, annihilate caste in India. But it hasn't happened or is in the process of happening. I hope that's the case. If I can come to you, Jenny, for a quick response to that question on third culture kids.
Right. So I don't actually have kids, but I have a lot of nephews and nieces in the US, and they are third culture children. And I would say, I do agree with Guruprasad that some of the issues that, say, my generation of third culture kids, who are my friends, Indian Americans who were born and raised in the US, some of the issues that they dealt with, some of the, let's call it, challenges with place and race and caste, etc., and having to kind of, jump on both sides of the Indian American hyphenated identity. I think those are getting better with the current generation, teens that's growing up. I want to mention, since we are all writers, I want to recommend two quick books that have come out this year by two writers. One, she herself is a third generation person. Sejal Shah has a book of memoir essays, and she talks a lot about growing up as Indian American, as Gujarati on the East Coast in Rochester, and beautiful essays that I think give a lot of light to this topic of being a third culture kid. And that's a book that's come out this year, so I'm just going to mention that. I got to know her through the podcast. And then real quick, just going back to the earlier question about casteism in the diaspora, Samir Pandya has a book out this month called Members Only. He's a Bay Area writer, and he talks about an upper caste Hindu whose name is Raj Bhatt. So we share the same last name, his protagonist and I. And that person has to deal with certain anti-Black biases that he may have had as an upper caste Hindu in America. So those two books actually shed light on both the topic of this question as well as the one we just had before. And I just wanted to mention those are good reads if anyone's looking for those.
Right. Over to you, Mitali, on your perspective on that very interesting but tricky question.
Yes. Yeah. Two thoughts on that. Third culture kids, I think it's another way of saying they're kids who are residing, who have grown up between cultures, as I like to call it. So you do that back and forth dance that I did. There is that perspective, but that term tends mostly to be used by children who are from the West, who grow up in other countries, like with international schools, or with whatever parents who are residing overseas, but they originate in the West. Because it's a power question, right? When you cross a border, if you're being raised as a white person, a white child in India, you're going to get a certain deference from that the group of people who adulate whiteness, who still adulate the colonial whiteness, the power associated with whiteness. So you're still walking around with that privilege of being white, and so that's a different experience than, say, a Haitian who settles in Maine and raises a child there. That is that person, yes, essentially they're both third culture children, but the power differential there is enormous in how they're perceived by the majority culture. So I lived in Bangladesh for 3 years, and one of the surprising fallouts of that is because I am large and strong and look sort of like I've had power, I was treated very deferentially there. And after 3 years, I found that it was taking a toll on my soul. I was starting to maybe subtly respond to that, how people were treating me with a power, as though I was a person of power. And I hated that in myself. I hated seeing that because I'm used to sort of being ignored here in the States. When I come up to a hotel counter, people, maybe there's that split second where they might look to the white person instead of me. I'm used to sort of, and I like being on the margins of power. It's better for my soul than it is being in that place of power. It's the same thing I feel about not crossing borders. People always say, oh, it's immigrant kids have such a hard time. I would say it's people who don't cross cultural borders, they're the ones that are at risk here, because your soul becomes at risk when you can't leave your own box of your own culture. And all you see is that is a risky place for your soul to be. So I would say that there's a lot of nuance in that third culture thing that comes with how powerful you're perceived in the culture where you're being raised.
Thank you so much for those very open and frank sort of responses to this. These responses are sometimes too close to the bone and can be quite difficult. If I sort of quickly go back to the chat that I think we were having on the panelists chat box, if I could come back to the idea of translation again, I think we had some really wonderful thoughts from Guru in the earlier part of our conversation on translation, and I'm trying to pick that also your comment, Mitali, that what you felt about Tagore's translation in English. And when I taught in Vishwabharati, I did teach Gitanjali Song Offerings translation as a translated text, and there's so much in there because Tagore translated himself, and he translated very loosely, and his language was not very contemporary English of the early 20th century, but of the previous century. He was deeply influenced by Tennyson. So many of his phrases, if you look closely, echoed Tennyson's In Memoriam in particular. So I just wanted to open this up to everyone that, how does translation impact you as authors living in a country that you call home now, but what's the position of translation? Does it help you reach greater audiences? Does it help you access other works that in turn inspire you? I would love to hear from all three of you on this.
I'll go. So I'm also a translator. So I translate from Gujarati to English. And I think first and foremost, all writers, regardless of the language that we speak in, we are all translators, right? We're translating some thoughts, ideas, experiences into language, things that we feel and think into words. And so I think we're all translators. I think just my experience of actual physical translation, going from one source language to a target language, I like to make sure that people understand that it's not just about converting language from one to another. We are converting entire experiences, entire cultures. So we as translators, we're immersing ourselves, just as writers also, immersing ourselves in a certain culture before we can translate it. And so I do believe in that sense, immigrants, people like us who have lived different cultures, we've immersed ourselves in different cultures, perhaps that has given us a bit of an ability to be able to do that in our writing, then, is to be able to translate entire cultures and immerse ourselves first and then translate the culture as we translate experiences. I think that for me, for example, my editor in India right now, it's interesting the conversations she and I are having as we're editing the translation, because the writer like actually Dhumketu was a contemporary of Tagore's, and he had a lot of respect for Tagore, and he met Tagore and everything. He translated Tagore's work as well into Gujarati. Now, what's interesting is, though, that Dhumketu isn't as well known because a lot of his work has not been translated. There's a lot more people translating from Bengali to English than there are from Gujarati to English. So what happens is, when you look at the stories that were written about the same time as Tagore's stories, and my editor in India is reading the stories that I've translated, and they're like, oh, but there's a lot of caste in this. And I said, well, he was a social reformer, this writer. He's not casteist himself. He's trying to show that people are casteist. There's a difference. And we have to understand that when we read translated works, that the work itself doesn't necessarily reflect who the writer is. They are trying to translate their own experiences and their own culture into a story. And so I think the more we read translations and we see them as works in their own right, the better we will understand other languages. That's also one way to travel. That's also one way to immerse ourselves into other cultures. And so I definitely encourage more people to read works in translation, especially from India. I mean, Arunava Sinha just did a recent post at Words Without Borders, where he said 10 translated novels that we should all be reading right now. And the reason is because every time there's a question that comes up about books from India, they're almost all in the English language, right? Every time somebody does a post at The Guardian or some big venue, it's always all English.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, translation as travel is a wonderful phrase, and Ornavo has done a brilliant job in taking a lot of Bengali literature certainly to the wider world. He translated Shankar's Chaurungi, which is fantastic. I mean, given that how long it took such a seminal novel to be translated into English. Over to you, Guru. I think you started this conversation, and then I'll come to Mitali about her thoughts on translation.
Well, it's very simple. I am on this panel because somebody translated my novel from Kannada to English. Otherwise, probably none of you would have heard about my novel. I've been writing for 20 years, and this is the first time one of my works was translated, even though a few of my short stories were translated. So I think there is we wouldn't have known Marquez or Van Rulf or lots of these wonderful writers if there were no translations. And I echo Jenny's thought that there is a wonderful, what we see right now, the translated works of Kannada to English, like Gachar Gochar, or like multiple other things. These are like, Vivek is a good friend of mine. It's a wonderful book, but these are like just the tips of iceberg. There is a wonderful, wonderful Kannada literature, some of which can be translated, some of which it's very hard to translate those because the language is so powerful. It's very hard to get the essence of that to English. So I don't think we should even try to translate those works. And Arunava mentions, and I have great respect for Arunava's work, and he does mention bad translation is better than no translation at all, because as long as you get something so that it might get better afterwards, you just go ahead and do the translations, and then let's see how it sticks. And it might, we need those in Kannada. We have not had like that luxury of having Arunava Sinha translate. He says like he translates like 250 to 300 page book in 1 month, 3,000 words in a day. Yeah, so
he's prodigious. He's a very good friend of mine. I know he's very, very prodigious. I think we have just about enough time for Mitali to have the final word on translation, and then we will have to bring this wonderful discussion to a close. But over to you, Mitali.
Thank you so much. I think we have to keep in mind the relationship around a story belongs equally to the reader and the writer. We as writers can do all our due diligence in translation and language and in examining our intentions and our appropriation, and we can do all of our due diligence, but essentially a story belongs to the reader. and the reader is going to do their work of translation. And that's the mystery of story, is that the reader takes it, and I can't say, oh, especially to a child, because I write for young people, this is the message, this is what I want you to take out. Sometimes I hear from readers things they took out of my novels that I didn't even imagine was in there. And that's the power of a story, is that the reception of the story, it's dialectical, it belongs to the reader and the writer. And we have no control over what the reader's going to do at the end of the day with that story. And that's really the mystery and the beauty of it.
Right. Thank you, panelists. Does anyone of you want to have one final word before we bring it to a close?
No, just to say thank you to all of you,
Thank
the
you
folks
so
at
much.
Team Belong and you. And it's
yeah.
been a terrific conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. So
Thank
interesting.
you, everyone.
I could listen to Guru and Jenny for a long, long time, more time than this. So thank you.
Same
Thank
here.
you so
I mean,
much,
it
Debanjan.
really is a real pleasure to talking to all of you. And I would like to place my thanks to the Belong Online Literature Festival team for having convened this wonderful panel and this festival, which has had such a real resonance across our networks across the world, and my colleagues in the literature team here in British Council India for this collaboration that they set up with the Belong Online Literature Festival. Thank you, everyone.